The first time I heard my own voice coming through my car speakers, I thought I was losing my mind. I was driving to work, half listening to some psychology podcast a friend had recommended, when the host started recounting a story that made my blood freeze. So this client of mine, the smooth, professional voice continued, came in last week absolutely convinced her husband was cheating because he'd started working late. Classic projection, really. Turns out she's the one having an affair with her personal trainer. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. Those were my words. My story. My deepest, most shameful secret that I'd whispered through tears in what I thought was the safety of Dr. Rebecca Martinez's office just 5 days earlier. I pulled over so fast I nearly sideswiped a parked car. My heart was hammering as I fumbled for my phone, rewinding the podcast episode. There it was again. My life, my pain, my marriage falling apart, being dissected for entertainment by thousands of strangers. The host, who I now realized was my own therapist, didn't use my name. She called me Sarah instead of Kelly. But every detail was identical. The way I'd described finding the gym membership charge on our credit card. How I'd confronted Mark about the late nights. Even the part about how I'd started the affair because I felt invisible in my own marriage. I sat in my car, shaking, as Dr. Martinez's voice continued to violate my trust with clinical precision. What's fascinating about cases like Sarah's, she was saying, is how the guilt manifests as hypervigilance about the partner's behavior. It's textbook displacement. 23 minutes. That's how long she spent turning my breakdown into content. 23 minutes of my trauma packaged as Mental Health Mondays with Dr. Rebecca. For context, I'd been seeing Dr. Martinez for 6 months. She came highly recommended, had stellar reviews online, and specialized in marriage counseling and infidelity recovery. Her office was warm and inviting, filled with soft lighting and tissues strategically placed on every surface. She had this way of nodding and hemming that made you feel heard, understood, validated. I'd trusted her with everything. The affair with Jake, my trainer, that had started as emotional support and escalated when Mark began working 70-hour weeks. The crushing guilt that kept me awake at night. The way I'd started picking fights with Mark about imaginary other women because I couldn't bear the weight of my own betrayal. And she'd turned it all into a podcast episode. I drove to work in a daze, my mind reeling with questions. How many other clients had she featured? How long had this been going on? Most importantly, was this even legal? The rest of the day passed in a fog. I couldn't concentrate on emails, couldn't focus on meetings. Every conversation felt surreal, like I was watching my life from outside my body. My coworker Jessica asked if I was feeling all right 3 different times. Just tired, I kept saying. But inside, I was calculating. Planning. Because if there's one thing you should know about me, it's that I don't stay down when someone kicks me. That evening, I locked myself in my home office and started researching. 3 hours later, I had my answer. What Dr. Martinez was doing wasn't just unethical, it was illegal. Patient confidentiality laws don't have exceptions for educational content or anonymized stories. Even changing names and minor details doesn't make it okay to broadcast someone's private therapy sessions to the world. But knowing I was right and proving it were 2 different things. I spent the next week becoming an expert on Dr. Martinez's podcast. Mental Health Mondays had been running for 8 months, with over 100,000 subscribers. Each episode featured composite cases from her practice, always with fake names, always framed as educational content for mental health awareness. The comments section was goldmine of praise. Listeners thanked her for normalizing therapy, for making psychology accessible, for sharing relatable stories. What they didn't know was that these weren't stories. They were real people's lives, stolen and repurposed without consent. I recognized at least 3 other episodes that seemed suspiciously specific. Episode 47, When Perfectionism Destroys Relationships, sounded exactly like my friend Maria's struggles with OCD. Episode 52, Addiction Recovery and Family Trauma, could have been lifted directly from my brother-in-law's sessions. But I needed proof. Real, undeniable evidence. That's when I noticed something interesting. Dr. Martinez always seemed to have her phone positioned at a specific angle during our sessions. I'd assumed she was taking notes on it, but now I wondered if she was recording. For my next appointment, I came prepared. "Kelly, you seem tense today," Dr. Martinez observed, settling into her chair with that practiced, concerned expression. "How are things with Mark?" I kept my voice steady, even as my heart pounded. "Actually, I wanted to ask you something. Do you ever record our sessions?" Her laugh was too quick, too rehearsed. "Of course not. Everything we discuss is completely confidential. Why do you ask? Just curious about your process, I said, watching her carefully. I know some therapists use recordings for supervision or continuing education. Not me, she insisted, but I caught the way her eyes flicked to her phone. I take detailed notes, but I never record patients. That would be a serious violation of trust. The irony would have been funny if it weren't so devastating. I spent that session feeding her a completely fabricated story about Mark and I renewing our wedding vows. I made it emotional, detailed, and utterly false. If my suspicions were right, Sarah would be celebrating a romantic reconciliation on next week's episode. Sure enough, Monday's podcast featured the story word for word. Sometimes, Dr. Martinez's voice cooed through my headphones. When couples commit to genuine vulnerability and change, beautiful healing can happen. Just last week, Sarah shared the most touching story about renewing her vows. I had her, but catching her wasn't enough. I wanted to understand the scope of this betrayal. How many people had she violated? How much money had she made from our pain? That's when I discovered the premium tier. Buried on her website, behind a paywall, was intimate case studies, extended, detailed versions of her podcast stories available for $29.99 a month. The promotional copy promised deep dives into complex psychological cases and unfiltered insights into the therapeutic process. I subscribed immediately. What I found there made my stomach turn. Full sessions, barely edited, with only names changed. My voice was there, clear as day, sobbing about my affair. Maria's panic attacks were dissected in clinical detail. Someone I didn't recognize was having a complete breakdown over childhood trauma while Dr. Martinez offered commentary like a nature documentary narrator. She wasn't just violating confidentiality, she was Monetizing our trauma, building a business empire on the backs of vulnerable people who trusted her with their deepest secrets. The premium content had over 3,000 subscribers. At $30 a month, that was $90,000 monthly in subscription revenue. Plus whatever she made from sponsorships on the regular podcast. She'd turned patient exploitation into a six-figure side hustle. I felt sick, betrayed, furious. But I also felt something else, determined. See, Dr. Martinez had made one crucial mistake. She'd assumed her patients were too ashamed, too broken, too isolated to ever discover what she was doing. She'd counted on our silence, our stigma, our tendency to suffer alone. She was about to learn how wrong she was. My plan started with documentation. I created a secure folder and began collecting evidence. Screenshots of the premium content featuring my sessions. Audio comparisons between the podcast and my actual words. Financial records showing her revenue streams. A timeline of episodes that corresponded with my appointment dates. But I needed more than just my own case. I needed other victims. That's where Jessica came in. My coworker who'd been asking if I was okay had actually started therapy recently after her divorce. When I carefully brought up the topic of podcasts and confidentiality, she went pale. "Oh my God," she whispered. Dr. Martinez asked me to sign some kind of media release form. Said it was standard paperwork for case study purposes. I didn't really read it. We spent the next 2 hours going through her paperwork. Buried in page 7 of 12, in the smallest font possible, was a clause that could potentially be interpreted as consent for educational content creation. It was deliberately vague, legally questionable, and ethically bankrupt. But it suggested Dr. Martinez knew exactly what she was doing. Jessica's story, her messy divorce, her ex-husband's gambling addiction, her struggles with single motherhood, had been featured in episode 71, Rebuilding After Betrayal. Every painful detail, broadcast to thousands of strangers who thought they were learning about psychology. I trusted her, Jessica said, tears streaming down her face. I told her things I've never told anyone. And she sold them. That night, I started building my case in earnest. I reached out to Maria, carefully probing about her therapy experience without revealing what I'd discovered. Her response confirmed my worst fears. She'd been seeing Dr. Martinez for anxiety and OCD, and her story had been featured in multiple episodes. "Sometimes I wonder if she's really helping me," Maria confided over coffee. "It feels like she's more interested in the dramatic parts of my anxiety than actually treating it. And she's always asking me to repeat details about my worst episodes." 3 victims identified. But I suspected there were many more. I spent the following week creating fake social media accounts and joining online therapy support groups. It didn't take long to find them, people discussing their experiences with a therapist who seemed more interested in collecting stories than providing treatment. A woman whose eating disorder recovery had been featured as Emma's journey. A man whose PTSD from military service had become Jake's battle with trauma. None of them knew they'd been exploited. They just knew something felt wrong about their therapeutic relationship. I started reaching out privately, carefully, sharing what I'd discovered. The response was immediate and devastating. People were horrified, angry, and heartbroken. Several had been loyal podcast listeners without realizing they were hearing their own stories. Within 2 weeks, I had identified 12 victims. 12 people whose trust had been violated, whose trauma had been monetized, whose healing had been secondary to content creation. It was time to act. But I knew going to the licensing board or filing complaints wouldn't be enough. Dr. Martinez would get a slap on the wrist, maybe lose her license, and move on. Her podcast would disappear, but she'd keep the money she'd made from our pain. I wanted something more satisfying. Something that would expose her not just to regulators, but to the world. That's when I discovered she was speaking at the Regional Psychology Conference the following month. The topic? Ethical considerations in mental health content creation. The irony was delicious. I registered for the conference under a fake name and started planning. The conference was everything I'd expected. Hundreds of mental health professionals gathered to discuss best practices, ethical guidelines, and patient care. Dr. Martinez was scheduled to speak on the final day, in the main auditorium, to an audience of her peers. I arrived early, set up my recording equipment, and waited. Her presentation was masterful, I'll give her that. She spoke eloquently about the importance of patient confidentiality, the ethical obligations of therapists, and the careful balance between education and exploitation. She even mentioned her own podcast as an example of how to share psychological insights while protecting patient privacy. Every story I share, she said with conviction, is carefully anonymized and composite to ensure no individual patient could ever be identified. Patient trust is the foundation of everything we do. The audience nodded approvingly. Several people took notes. That's when I stood up. Dr. Martinez, I said, my voice carrying clearly through the microphone at my seat. I have a question about anonymization techniques. Her eyes found mine in the crowd. For just a moment, I saw recognition flicker across her face. Then her professional mask slipped back into place. Of course, she said smoothly. What would you like to know? I pulled out my phone and pressed play. My voice filled the auditorium, the real recording of me sobbing about my affair, followed immediately by her podcast version with minimal changes. The contrast was unmistakable. The room went silent. You could have heard a pin drop. This is from your premium content, I continued, my voice steady despite my racing heart. The woman you call Sarah is actually me, Kelly. I never consented to this. In fact, when I asked you directly if you recorded sessions, you lied to my face. Dr. Martinez's face had gone white. She gripped the podium like it was the only thing keeping her upright. That's not, these are composite cases based on. No. I stood up fully now, facing the audience. They are not. I have documentation proving that at least 12 patients' actual sessions were recorded without consent, minimally edited, and sold for profit. She made nearly $100,000 last month from our trauma. I could see phones being pulled out around the room. People were recording this confrontation, just as Dr. Martinez had recorded us. She builds trust with vulnerable people, encourages them to share their deepest secrets, then broadcasts those secrets to thousands of strangers. She's not just violating ethics, she's breaking the law. The conference organizer was making frantic gestures from the side of the stage. Security was moving through the crowd. But I wasn't finished. To everyone listening, I said, looking directly into the cameras now recording me, if you've been a patient of Dr. Rebecca Martinez, check her podcast. You might find your own story being sold for entertainment. Security reached me as I was sitting back down, but the damage was done. The room erupted into chaos. Therapists were pulling out their phones, some to call their licensing boards, others to record the scene unfolding on stage. Dr. Martinez tried to continue her presentation, but her voice was shaking. Several people got up and left. Others started asking pointed questions about consent and patient rights. The conference ended early that day. Within hours, video of my confrontation was trending on social media. #TherapistScandal became a hashtag. Mental health advocates were sharing the story. Legal experts were being interviewed about patient rights. Dr. Martinez's podcast was suspended by Tuesday. Her premium content platform was shut down by Thursday. The Psychology Licensing Board opened an investigation on Friday. But the real victory came from the patients who found their voices. Over the next month, 17 people came forward as victims of Dr. Martinez's exploitation. Their stories were heartbreaking. Trauma survivors who'd trusted her with their healing, only to discover their pain had been commodified. We formed a support group, ironically enough. We met weekly, sharing our experiences and supporting each other through the legal process that followed. Several members sued for damages. Others filed complaints with ethics boards. All of us found healing in community and truth-telling. Dr. Martinez lost her license 6 months later. She was ordered to pay restitution to her victims and faced criminal charges for violating privacy laws. Her podcast empire crumbled, her reputation destroyed, her profitable exploitation scheme exposed for what it was. But the most satisfying part wasn't her downfall, it was what we built from the ashes. The experience taught me something valuable about power, trust, and speaking truth. For months, I'd felt broken, isolated, ashamed of my affair and guilty about my marriage. Dr. Martinez had fed on that shame, using my vulnerability against me. But when I found my voice, when I chose truth over silence, everything changed. Not just for me, but for every person she'd exploited. Mark and I eventually worked through our issues, in therapy with a different, properly licensed counselor who actually helped instead of harvesting our pain. We renewed our vows for real, not for podcast content. Jessica got the support she needed for her divorce recovery. Maria found an OCD specialist who treated her condition instead of sensationalizing it. The other victims found healing through community and justice. As for me, I learned that sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even, it's getting truth. It's refusing to stay silent when someone abuses their power. It's protecting others from experiencing the same betrayal you survived. Dr. Martinez thought she could hide behind professional credentials and fake concern. She counted on our shame to keep us quiet, our isolation to keep us powerless. She was wrong, and her spectacular downfall proved that no one, no matter how educated, credentialed, or trusted, is above accountability. The sickest part of it all, she never did help me process my guilt about the affair. She was too busy recording it for content to actually provide therapy. But standing up to her, protecting other vulnerable people, speaking truth in that auditorium, that was more healing than any session ever could have been. Because sometimes the best way to heal from betrayal is to make sure it never happens to anyone else. 3 years later, I still get messages from people who saw my confrontation and found the courage to speak up about their own experiences with exploitation, not just in therapy, but in all areas of life. Bosses who violated boundaries, partners who betrayed trust, systems that failed to protect the vulnerable. My story became bigger than just one unethical therapist. It became a reminder that silence protects predators, but truth protects people. Dr. Martinez learned that the hard way. And I learned something even more valuable, that surviving betrayal is powerful, but preventing future betrayals is transformational. Sometimes the most savage revenge is simply refusing to let someone else become a victim. The last I heard, Dr. Martinez was working as a data entry clerk in another state. No more podcasts. No more premium content. No more profiting from other people's pain. Just the consequences of her choices, following her wherever she goes. As they should.